Here are 5 questions that you can ask yourself if you have anxiety before games. Question number 1 is, what am I thinking about? So this sports performance anxiety that you experience before games, it's going to be characterized by worries. Worries about what's going to happen. The reason that you want to ask yourself what I'm thinking about is it's going to help direct your attention to what exactly is driving the anxiety in the first place. Your anxiety before games is experienced as thought. It's a thought about what's going to happen, and specifically thoughts about things you probably don't want to have happen. You might be worried about, am I going to make a mistake? You might be worried about, is coach going to bench me if I do make a mistake? I've had a lot of athletes I've worked with who have been worried about what other people are going to think of them. When that's the kind of stuff you're thinking about going into games, it starts to become clear where this anxiety is coming from. Question number 2 is you want to ask yourself, what am I afraid of? And this really ties into question number 1. By figuring out what you're afraid of, you're going to get a deeper understanding of what's driving this anxiety. For example, if you figure out that you're thinking about other people, it might be that you're afraid of losing the approval of other people. What that starts to tell us is that going into games, you might need to focus on giving that approval to yourself, and especially after games, you need to work on giving that approval to yourself. I was actually just working with an athlete on this yesterday, where we were talking about, how during games he is so worried about what other people are thinking of him, and he's specifically worried about losing their approval, them thinking that he's not a good player. So we talked a lot about how through some evaluation exercises, he can start giving himself that approval. And if he starts giving himself the approval, he's not going to look for it in other people. If he's not looking for that approval in other people so much, he's not going to experience as much anxiety going into games in the first place. Question number 3 is this anxiety helpful? Now, I know that kind of right off the bat, the answer feels like a screaming no, because you wouldn't be trying to figure out how to manage your anxiety if you thought the anxiety was helpful. But here's the thing. If anxiety is caused by your thinking, your worries about what's going to happen, on some level, it can feel like worrying and thinking about, okay, I don't want to make this mistake, is somehow going to impact and influence you not making the mistake. But it's actually the complete opposite. By spending time worrying about what's going to happen and thinking about what's going to happen, you increase your chances of having that negative outcome happen. A perfect example of this is when I've worked with swimmers in the past. When I've worked with swimmers and they're experiencing anxiety, for the most part, that anxiety is going to be centered around not wanting to increase their time during races. So before the race happens, if the anxiety is being felt, it's because the anxiety is focused on not wanting to increase their time because that's going to be embarrassing, or for whatever reason that they're anxious, that thought is there. But when we get to this idea and ask the question, is this anxiety helpful? So is the anxiety you're feeling before the race helping you lower your time? Because that's going to be the opposite of having their time increased. It's pretty clear that the answer is no. And the reason that we go through that question and I have them really focus on that is because we have to start thinking, what actually would help me get the outcome that I want? When we look at anxiety and see that it is your worry about what's going to happen that's driving this anxiety, and specifically the worry about not wanting to make mistakes. The mistake or not wanting to make mistakes, that's not a bad thing. That's exactly what you want to have happen. You don't want to make mistakes when you're out there. You want to play your best. But before a game or before a race, going off of the swimmer's example, it's not going to do any good to be worrying about making mistakes. Instead, you want to be focused on what's going to help you perform your best. So with swimmers, I really work on getting their attention more on, their technique and more pieces of the process that are going to help them swim their best. So ask yourself, is this anxiety helpful? The answer is clearly no, it's not helpful, but that question starts to guide your attention back onto the process, which is actually going to be helpful when it comes to you performing your best. Now, these last 2 questions really tie into one another. Question number 4 is, am I blaming other people or am I blaming the environment? The reason that this question is very important for you to ask yourself is because the only way you're going to be able to manage anxiety going into games is if you take full responsibility for the anxiety that you feel. If you're blaming your coach for the fact that you're feeling anxious, coach has control over your anxiety. If you're blaming the people in the stands or the people that are watching for your anxiety, they have control over your anxiety. If you blame the other team, the fact that you're playing this really good team, or even the fact that you're playing in this big game, if you're blaming that for the reason that you're feeling anxious, once again, you're giving that environment, you're giving the other team the control over your anxiety. So you want to ask yourself, am I blaming others or am I blaming the situation or the environment because you have to start taking control and taking responsibility for the fact that you're anxious. Now, that might seem a little harsh in the beginning, but what's really cool about that is if you're taking responsibility for the fact that you're anxious and you're accepting control over that, do you know what you're also taking responsibility for? Doing something about it. And that takes us to question number 5. What can I do to help? In the moment when you're feeling anxious, what can you do to help yourself? For the most part, this is going to involve some form of bringing your attention back into the present moment and, taking some deep breaths to really work on calming yourself down. The solution for managing anxiety before games doesn't need to be complex, but it does take attention and work. The very simple kind of formula is when you're feeling anxious, you're thinking and worrying about the future. So you need to bring your attention back into the present moment. So the answer to what you can do to help is going to be some form of bringing your attention back into the here and now and focusing on what's actually going to help you perform your best. Now, there are also some tools that you can use and some exercises you can use going into a game to really work on bringing that attention back into the present moment. So what I've done right here is I've linked another video that goes into detail on some pre-game exercises that you can use to manage your anxiety as an athlete. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos each week on sports psychology and mental training.